Hi everyone, and welcome back to a new episode of Unmuted. If you tuned in last time, we talked about how we spent over a century wrongly labeling terrified kids as defiant or stubborn, while talking about the history of selective mutism, and ultimately learning that selective mutism is fundamentally an anxiety disorder. Today, we are opening up the hood of the brain to look at the actual mechanics. This episode is about the anxiety-language connection. Have you ever been so startled that you gasped but couldn't yell? Or maybe you've had a nightmare where something's chasing you and you open up your mouth to scream for help and absolutely nothing comes out. And so, if you have experienced that, for a child or adult with selective mutism, that nightmare can happen in broad daylight or in the middle of your classroom or even grocery store. It is a state where the brain's survival mechanics completely hijack your language center. We're going to look at the ultimate evolutionary neurological design flaw and how the brain's primitive fear circuitry can completely override our most advanced human trait, which is speech. To understand why speech drops when the brain is on selective mutism, we have to look at the two main players, the amygdala and the prefrontal cortex, or PFC. Think of the amygdala as your brain's internal smoke detector, as we've stated before. It's the almond-shaped cluster of neurons buried deep in the primitive emotional center of your brain. Its only job is to keep you alive. It constantly scans the environment, asking, "Is that going to kill me?" Now think of the PFC, located right behind your forehead, as the CEO of the brain. The PFC handles logic, planning, social etiquette, complex decision-making. It's the part of the brain that says, "Hey, that loud noise was just a car backfiring. Don't jump into the bushes." In a neurotypical brain, there's a very beautiful dynamic that's happening between these two areas. The amygdala gets startled, and then the PFC would evaluate the situation, apply some logic, and maybe mediate the amygdala by calming it down. But in a brain wired on selective mutism, that communication channel ultimately breaks down. For example, when a teacher walks up to a child with selective mutism and asks, "Did you finish reading?" the child's amygdala doesn't really see a teacher holding a book. And because of a hyper-reactive threat threshold, the amygdala registers the social expectation as a literal apex predator. It misinterprets the social pressure as a physical threat to survive. What happens next is that the amygdala takes over. When the brain triggers a severe threat response, it initiates what many neuroscientists call an amygdala hijack. The primitive survival brain decides that higher order thinking is a luxury we cannot afford to expend right now. For example, if a tiger is running at you, you don't really need to compose very eloquent sentences, and you would rather need to react. So the amygdala fires a massive distress signal down the brainstem, flooding the brain with cortisol and adrenaline, and at the same time, it actively throttles the PFC. Blood flow is diverted away from the logical executive centers and sent straight to your major muscle groups so you can run or fight. And here is the most tragic part of selective mutism. The language centers of the brain live right in the areas that just got shut down. For example, Broca's area, the part of the brain that is responsible for physically producing speech, and Wernicke's area, which processes language, relying heavily on a calm, fully functional PFC. When the amygdala shuts down the prefrontal cortex, it ultimately kind of pulls the plug for language. The child really isn't thinking, I think I will choose not to answer the teacher today. The child is actually in a frantic loop of say something. Just say yes. Why can't I say yes? Say anything. But the physical wiring required to translate that thought into a vibration in your vocal cord has been completely disconnected by the survival brain. So when the sympathetic nervous system fires up, it causes many immediate physical changes. And if you look at a child frozen by selective mutism during an episode, you see a somatic loop in action that kind of goes something like this. First, there's vocal cord hypertonicity, which is the intense rush of adrenaline caused by involuntary muscle tensions throughout the body, including the larynx or the voice box. The vocal cords lock so tightly together that pushing air past them to create sound becomes physically painful or impossible. Another symptom is the blank mask, where the muscles in the face freeze. Child develops a completely flat, emotionless expression in stiff wooden posture. This is often misread by adults as apathy, coldness, or anger, when it's actually the physical manifestation of a severe freeze response. Looking someone in the eye increases social engagement, which increases the data the amygdala has to process, which is why a third symptom is eye contact avoidance. The child will look on the floor, at a wall, trying to desperately reduce the sensory input overwhelming its brain. The worst part is that every time this happens and a child successfully escapes the situation without speaking, maybe like the teacher gives up and walks away, the amygdala kind of takes a sigh of relief and thinks, oh wow, we didn't speak and like we survived, so silence will keep us even safer. The brain literally rewires itself to view silence as a life-saving mechanism and makes the connection in this loop even stronger the next time. So how do we fix this faulty alarm? And how do we break this connection in the anxiety language bridge? We have to bypass the amygdala and talk directly to the prefrontal cortex, and we do that by changing the environment. If you want a child with selective mutism to speak, you have to completely eliminate the perceived threat. You don't do that by demanding eye contact or conquering them. You do it by utilizing warmed up environments. You let them play quietly without demanding speech. You use non-evaluative praise. You show their amygdala over and over through safe, low-stakes interactions that the classroom isn't really a cave full of predators in a sense. And once the amygdala stops firing so much, the blood flow returns back to the prefrontal cortex, the vocal cords will start to relax, and the language centers will come back together. So speech cannot be forced out of a tensed throat. You have to unlock and warm up the brain first. So thank you so much for joining me with this episode of Unmuted. See you next time.